Hello boys and girls, and welcome to this X-Plane 11 VFR flight through Norway. And it's going to be part of a series I intend to make, which is going to be called Tour of Norway. And one of the reasons why I'm making this video is that I just recently saw a couple of videos on a channel called 0321 Short. I'm going to put the link to his channel in the show notes. And he basically did a really enjoyable flight through his home country of the Netherlands. And what he did was that he basically talked us through everything we saw, like the cities, the nature, landscape, and he knew a lot of interesting stuff that I didn't know about the Netherlands, and I thought it was a really nice way to learn a little bit more about the country. And since I am maybe like him, very interested in not only flying but also history, geography, culture, I thought it could be fun to do something similar for my home country of Norway. So before we leave, I will show you the map quickly to give you a little bit of an idea about where we are in the world. So this is Europe, and this is Norway. It's a very long country. It has one of the longest coastlines in Europe, if not the longest. Of course, when we do a VFR flight to sort of show you the most interesting parts of Norway, the first problem we're going to have is that Norway is too big to show you everything. The Netherlands is quite small. Sjord could fly almost everywhere in a couple of hours. We can't do that, so we're going to have to make a selection. And what I have done is that I have made this round trip of Norway, and I have been to all of these places myself, and I think they are the most interesting places that I could show you in a few videos, offering not only really beautiful and dramatic landscapes, but also a lot of cool points where I can try to share some maybe hopefully interesting stories. So as you can see, I split it into some different parts to avoid making the videos too long. And for this first video, we're going to travel here from Hamar to a tiny and exotic airport on the mountain here called Wadahl. So one thing you need to know about Norway, in case you didn't already know, is that it's basically almost totally covered in mountains. The mountains start down here and they cover this whole inland area, and they stretch all the way up along the coast over here, almost to the border with Russia. And since mountains are not super great for farming and building cities and stuff, most of the people in Norway, they live here and up along the coast here. And what I think is really cool about this aspect is how the geography basically influences culture. So since people lived historically on both sides of this huge mountain, they lived in very different ways. Here people were mostly farmers, and they are sort of protected by the hard weather from the sea by the mountains here, and that sort of influenced not only how they built cities and how they live their life, but even their language. They speak in a different way here than they do over here. So if you ever come to Norway and you drive from Oslo or over the mountains and you come down on the other side, you'll notice how it's almost like coming to a different country. The houses look different, the cities look different, the landscape looks very different, and they talk in a different way. So actually looking at the map, I think it's almost strange that the border with Sweden is not running through the mountain here, because it would almost make more sense for this area here to become a part of Sweden. But of course the border with Sweden has its own natural barriers. This is basically just a big, almost a big empty forest. So I guess that's maybe one of the reasons why this is today a part of Norway. I am from Oslo. I grew up in this area, but I have traveled almost everywhere in Norway. So I think I know a little bit about the country. For this today's flight, we're going to fly from the small town of Hamar up and over Mjøsa, which is the largest inland sea in Norway. It looks like a river, but it is a sea. And we're going to follow the sea up here to its end over Lillehammer, and then we're going to enter a very famous valley in Norway called Gudbrandsdalen, which has a long and interesting history, which I'm going to try to tell you a little bit about. And we're going to fly up this valley about halfway. It continues up here until we reach Hundorp, and then we're going to make a hard left turn up over the valley side and into the mountains. And we're going to fly a little bit over the mountains and land at this tiny little runway at Wadahl, which is the tallest airport in Norway. It couldn't really be called an airport, it's just a grass strip. And it's very challenging to land there. I might crash the airplane, sorry for that in advance. People actually do crash there in real life because it's a very challenging runway. And I'm not going to land there to sort of show off my terrible flying skills, but basically just because there are no other runways in this area, and if I were to fly all the way to the next destination, the video would be a bit too long, I think. So that's what we're gonna try to do. So let's get going. Here we are at Hamar Stafsberg airport, a tiny little general aviation airport, almost located in the middle of the town. And it's one of the, I heard, one of the sort of the airports in Norway that has the most stable environment. There's very little fog here, so it can be open when almost all the other airports in Norway have to close. But the people who live here, they don't like it that much. They think it makes too much noise, so I heard some rumors that they are going to close it soon, sadly. But not today. Today we can start our flight here from Hamar. So let's go. Now, I have to warn you that I am not an experienced general aviation pilot, neither in Flight Simulator or in real life. I just recently installed X-Plane 11, and before that I used to play Flight Simulator X, and I basically only flew big airliners using autopilots mostly. So if you think my flying is terrible, that's probably the reason why. But this video is not really going to be as much about flying as it's going to be about the beautiful scenery in X-Plane 11 and Norway. So this is Hamar. The city is over here. It has about 20,000 people living here, I think. It has a little bit of a special significance for me because my family originally comes from here. And for several generations, my family basically ran the local bank in this town. But they don't do that anymore, and I have no family here anymore. But I have been here several times. And it's a quite nice, typical Eastern Norwegian small town. And it has a little bit of an interesting history, which goes all the way back to the Viking ages, where this was sort of a local capital. It doesn't look like this in real life, but I do believe this building here is what we call the Viking ship. And it's an ice skating hall, which was built for the 1994 Winter Olympics. And it's really beautiful. It was designed by a Norwegian architect called Nils Torp. And it's of course called the Viking ship because it looks like a Viking ship turned upside down. And each year they have a huge computer game event, like a LAN, called The Gathering. So through history, I'm sure there has been some flight simulator going on in there. So if you're ever going here to, maybe you could bring your computer and play in that hall. Here goes the main train line from Oslo up to Trondheim in the north, which is the third largest city in Norway. So this is one of the most important train lines in Norway. And another important or interesting thing about this town, if you ever go here, it's out here. This is called the Domkirkeodden, and it's here you'll find the ruins of a large medieval Roman style church, which is really beautiful, because back in the Middle Ages this was an important trade town, and the Pope in Rome decided that this place should have its own bishop, and they built this huge church. And another famous Norwegian architect called Sverre Fehn later designed sort of a museum around this church, so it's a really cool place if you ever visit this area. So now we are flying over Mjøsa, the largest inland sea in Norway. It continues a little bit further down south here to a place called Minnesund, and from there it's about maybe an hour's drive into Oslo. But we are not going to Oslo today, we are going there in a later video. Today we are going to travel north along the sea here. This is Helgøya. It is actually the largest inland island in Norway. And as you can see, it has a lot of farms today, but historically this was a very important, I think even a holy site for like the Norse religion. And the reason why this island was so important is that if you wanted to control this whole land around us, what you basically did was that you put your fortress or settlement on this island, and you had a lot of maybe Viking boats, and you could be protected on this island, and you could row around and just control the entire area. So I think there's also been actually a lot of battles historically for control of this small island. And I know archaeologists love this place because they keep finding old Viking swords and stuff like that coming up all the time on this island. I'm sorry if the flight simulator is a little bit laggy. It usually runs quite smooth, but with the recording software it seems to be causing a little bit of lag. So I hope that's not too much of an issue. So now we are turning north to follow Mjøsa. Over here you can see another small town, almost the same size as Hamar over here, about 20,000 people. And Gjøvik, it's not, I don't believe it has such a long medieval history as Hamar. I think it rose to prominence maybe around 150 years ago. And the reason why this became a large town is because it has a river coming down from the hills over here, and in the middle of this area is a huge waterfall, which they could use to power factories, so it's an industrial town. Of course, Norway, like most European countries, has lost most of its industry, but I know that they still produce some steel and iron products in this town, and it's quite a nice little town. Down by the seaside here, they have this glass house. I think it's here, which during the winter houses a ship called Skipblader, which is very famous. Most Norwegians have heard about this ship, and it's I believe the oldest steam paddle boat still in commercial operation in the world. And it's I think at least over 100 years old, or 100 years old. and each summer it travels very slowly, of course, up and down this sea for tourists. It's a really nice trip if you ever decide to come and visit. I think it's here. You can take it from any town along this sea. So Mjøsa, it is the border between two counties in Norway. This is Hedmarken, which is a huge, quite flat county which stretches to the border with Sweden. And this is Toten, which is a part of the county of Oppland, which is the only county in Norway which doesn't have a border with the sea or with another country. So it's the only sort of true inland county in all of Norway. And what you will notice immediately is that I told you Norway is full of mountains, but this area is one of the rare exceptions. It's quite flat, which means that it's good for farming. Norway is not an easy place to farm, but this is one of the better areas to do farming, which means that historically this was a quite rich farming area, and therefore also important to control if you wanted to be king of Norway. So that's why this place has such an important medieval history. The Sea of Mjøsa is very deep. I think it goes 500 meters down at some places. And it was formed by ice. Several ice ages sort of carved up this whole area. And another reason why this place is so good for farming is that during the ice ages, when basically everything you see here was covered in ice, it was so heavy that it actually just pushed all of the ground down, so that maybe not here but a little bit further south, this was actually under the sea. And when the ice melted, the ground started rising, but before it started rising, the sea flowed in, carrying in sand and mud to these areas, and that made for very fertile soil. So if you're a farmer in Norway, this is one of the places where you want to be. This is Mjøsbrua, which is, I believe, the only bridge sort of covering the full width of the lake. And it's part of E6, Europavei 6, which is the main road to Trondheim. And actually it starts all the way down in Trelleborg in Sweden, which is close to Copenhagen and Malmö, and it continues all the way through Norway and up to Kirkenes, which is close to the border with Russia. So every Norwegian will know about E6. It's a very important road. So I have traveled through this valley many times in my life because my family has a cabin in the mountains over here. We're gonna fly over it, and I really like this place, even though it's definitely one of the least dramatic areas of Norway in terms of landscape, because it's so flat. It's really beautiful because of all the old farms, just the wheat fields. And the sea, it's really, really beautiful. So if you ever decide to come to Norway and rent a car, which is probably the best way to visit Norway, then I would definitely recommend you start your trip from Oslo up here, coming to Gudbrandsdalen, which is where we're going now. And if you are into fishing, I know that this sea has a lot of fish, a lot of trout, I believe. So there's a lot of fishing going on there, and also it's a good place to swim in the few months of summer when it's warm enough. Although I do believe historically this sea was also quite polluted. There was, as I mentioned, some industry here, and back in the 1800s they also didn't know much about bacteriology, so I know that they let all their sewage straight into the lake, which they also use for drinking water. So historically there were a few plagues here, typhoid plagues, caused by this confusement of drinking water and sewage. But today I think it is relatively clean, because people do eat fish from this sea. Coming up on the side here is Lillehammer, which is the capital of Oppland County, and it's definitely a very interesting small town for several reasons. It has a lot of small, beautiful wooden houses, and a lot of festivals and culture, and it's a really beautiful and interesting place. And of course, in 1994 it was the host city of the Winter Olympics. So actually, if you are interested, you could go to YouTube and you could search for Winter Olympics 1994 opening ceremony, and you will see what I think is one of the coolest opening ceremonies in the history of the Winter Olympics, at least, which was hosted on the ski jump. So that's where they put the opening ceremony. They built a huge outdoor stadium at the bottom of the ski jump, which is right here. So if you see that video, you'll see a really, really beautiful, cool show right here. I was a little bit too young back then to really pay much attention, but I think it was a pretty good Olympics, that one in 1994. And also, because of that Olympics, much later they made a show which you can see on Netflix called Lillehammer, which stars, I forgot his name, but one of the mobsters playing in Soprano. He is the star of that show, an American guy. Lillehammer is basically a show about him ratting out his New York mobster boss, and he goes into a FBI witness protection program. And they ask him, where do you want to go to start your new life? And he says, I want to go to Lillehammer, Norway, which he doesn't know anything about, but he saw the Winter Olympics and he fell in love with the town. And then the show is basically about this New York mobster coming to live here. He starts his own nightclub in this town and starts doing like criminal stuff, and it's supposed to be a comedy about sort of the culture clash between a New York mobster and the sort of naive Norwegian small town mentality. So it's not a brilliant show, but a quite fun show, worth checking out. Over here, I believe, is Jørstadmoen, or it's here, which is a military camp. During the Second World War, the Germans used it as a concentration camp. And famously, what the Nazis tried in Norway, which they also tried in all the other countries they occupied, was to sort of Nazify the schools. And the Norwegian teacher union, they didn't want to be a part of this, so they refused, and hundreds, if not thousands, of teachers were all interned at this military camp. And later it became a prisoner camp for, I think, mostly Russian prisoners of war that were put to slave labor, and many of them died. So now we are entering Gudbrandsdalen, this valley I told you about, which is very important both today and through Norway's history, because it's basically the main gateway from Oslo and Europe to Trondheim in the north, which used to be the capital once, and it's still Norway's third largest city. And if you continue up the valley, it's like a crossroads at one point where you can either turn right and you have to go over the mountains of Dovre to come down to Trondheim, or you can go over the mountains of Jotunheimen, which is where we will fly in our next video, to come down to western Norway, which historically had a lot of fish and stuff. It still does, of course. Over here is Hunderfossen Familiepark. It's a theme park about Norwegian fairy tales with like roller coasters, with trolls and all the stuff from Norwegian fairy tales. So been there a lot as a child, and it's really, really cool as a child. For an adult, it's maybe not that interesting. And in case you didn't know, Trondheim, the city up here in the north behind the mountains, it used to be a holy city in the Catholic Church in the medieval ages. Basically there were 4 holy cities, the 4 holiest cities in the Christian world, which was sort of designed cleverly by the church to form a cross over Europe. Of course, it's not really a cross, but they didn't really know how the map looked like back then. So in the north you had Trondheim as the most holy city, in the west you had Santiago de Compostela in Spain, and in the south you had Rome, and in the east you had Jerusalem. So this was this city of Trondheim, or it was called Nidaros back then. It was a place where a lot of Christians from all over Northern Europe would go on a pilgrimage. And of course, traveling, at least in the medieval ages, all the way through Norway was a very tough, very dangerous trip. And most of them would travel through this valley. And at some point, when you reach the end of the valley, you have to go over the mountains, which could of course also be very dangerous because the weather changes quickly in the mountains. So all through this valley, even today, you have a lot of old churches. This is where the pilgrims would stop and pray for a safe journey across the mountains. And even today you can still do the pilgrimage walk. It's not done by so many pilgrims though, I believe, but it's a really nice walk that you can do all the way from Oslo to Trondheim. And you almost never have to walk along like car roads. It's just through nature. And Gudbrandsdalen was also the scene of really one of the main battles of Norway during the Second World War. What happened then was that the Germans they invaded Norway on the night of April 9th, 1940, and they did a sort of ninja attack on Norway, using almost all their navy to transport troops into all the major cities of Norway at the same time, along with paratroopers. So in one day they took Oslo, Kristiansand, I believe, Stavanger, Bergen, Trondheim, and Narvik in the north. And they took the Norwegians completely by surprise. The Norwegians were totally unprepared, hadn't mobilized, and after the attack they did of course start mobilizing. But since all of the main population centers were already taken, there weren't that many troops to mobilize. But in this area, in the far inland, they did mobilize. And the Norwegian king and the government, they retreated up this valley using the train. And the Germans were in pursuit using trucks and tanks, and also airplanes, Stuka dive bombers. And so what was left of the small Norwegian army, they dug down in this valley, and they covered the retreat of the king and the government through this valley. And the way the battles would work, the Norwegians would entrench themselves. Their flanks would be protected by the mountains, and they would halt the Germans. It wasn't that difficult, I believe, because it's quite narrow. But they were under attack from the air by these Stuka dive bombers. They didn't have any anti-aircraft weapons. And then when the Germans managed to rig their artillery to bombard the entrenched Norwegians, they would retreat a few hundred meters backwards, and then the process would start all over again. So slowly the Germans kept pushing the Norwegians backwards. And on the western side of Norway, the British and the French and the Polish, I believe, landed reinforcements that came into this valley and fought very bravely with the Norwegians. But they also didn't have much anti-air weapons or artillery or anti-tank weapons. So even with the help of the French and the English and the Polish, they couldn't stop the Germans. And of course, since all the cities were taken, even Trondheim in the north, there weren't really any good places to retreat to. They were being sort of fighting on all fronts, no place to really do a last stand, like a Helm's Deep sort of fight. So when the Germans reached the end here, all of the forces in southern Norway capitulated. The fight still continued up in the north, though, where the Germans actually suffered their first defeat, military defeat, in World War II, fighting Norwegians and Polish and French and English. But then later France fell, as you know, and the English and the French decided that they now had to defend their homeland, and so they understandably, I think, retreated. That was the end of the Battle of Norway, which lasted 3 months, I believe. You could argue that had the Norwegians been better prepared, had they mobilized and defended their cities, it wouldn't have been impossible to defend Norway, because the Germans couldn't use their entire military, of course, to attack Norway. And Norway, geographically, is very easy to defend. So we will, in a later video, we will fly over some other scenes which have interesting stories from the Second World War. This valley is very beautiful, I think. It has a lot of traditional medieval farms, which were situated up here on the upper side of the valley, and then they would do farming down here by the river. And this river is really, really beautiful. The water is, in reality, actually green, because it's ice water flowing down from the mountains, and ice water is very green. So it looks almost like a tropical lake in real life, but it's of course ice cold, so you need to be quite tough to swim here, even in the summer. And if you're here as a tourist, you can rent overnight housing in some of these old farms. Some of them are like 1,000 years old, so it's really, really fun to live a night in these old farms and get up early in the morning and see the sun come up, and you can almost sort of imagine how it was to live here in the medieval ages. Up here is Hundorp, where we would make our left turn up over the mountains. Hundorp is also the site of a very important medieval farm, and it also has a really nice church called Sørfront Kirke, which was built in the 1700s, which is one of the few Rococo-style churches built in wood in the world, as far as I know. So that's definitely also worth a visit. Another thing to note about this valley, another interesting story was during the, I believe it was the 30-year War. This was part of Denmark, or Norway was in the Union with Denmark, and we were fighting against Sweden. Maybe it wasn't the 30-year War, but it was some war in the 1500s. And the Swedish king, he hired mercenaries from Scotland. And they couldn't, to reach Sweden, they couldn't sail past Denmark because the Danish fleet, the Danish-Norwegian fleet, basically would fight them off. So they landed on the western side of Norway and decided to march through all of Norway to reach Sweden. And when they came to this valley, some local farmers saw this train of Scottish mercenaries coming, and they decided to call the yoke of war and gathered all the farmers in the valley, who took their knives and their pitchforks, and they hid it up in the mountainside and came down on the Scottish army and basically slaughtered them. And it's a very small and insignificant battle in European history, but in this valley, where back then there wasn't that much going on, it became the stuff of legends. So it's a well-remembered story, this little event in the 1500s, I believe. So now we are flying up towards the mountain. This is a place called Gålå, which is not a particularly special mountain in Norway. It has a few cabins and some winter sports. But you'll find other mountains in Norway that are way more popular than this one. The reason why we are flying here is because it has special significance to me. I've been here so many times, so many summers in my life, because right up on top of here is where my great-grandfather built the family cabin. A really beautiful old timber cabin built on this place, which is what we in Norwegian call a seter. They are all over the mountains of Norway, and the seter is basically where the farmers living down in the valleys would come up in the summer with their sheep and maybe their cattle, and they would roam freely around here eating the grass. And then when autumn came, they would gather their animals and take them back down to the valley. So this is one of those seters, and it's really beautiful. It has a lot of really old farms. I absolutely love spending the summers here. We swim in this lake. It's called Wadahl, and we do hiking, which is what Norwegians basically do when they go to the mountains. We very often go to this mountain, for example, which is about walking from here and over there is like a 2-hour walk. So this is the mountains of Norway. And when you're standing up here, or also from our cabin window, you can see these beautiful mountain ranges. They're actually even as beautiful as X-Plane 11 is. This doesn't really do it justice. It's so beautiful in real life. This is the mountains of Dovre, which is the main mountains you have to cross to get to Trondheim behind. And this mountain here is can't see too well in the simulator, but it's my favorite mountain in all of Norway. It's called Rondeslottet, which means this whole mountain area is called Rondane, and Rondeslottet means the Ronde Castle. And the reason why it's called that is because it can't really see it, but in real life it looks like a building, a castle. And there is a very famous painting made by Theodor Kittelsen, I believe, in the 1800s, when they were sort of really into everything national, romantic. He made a really beautiful painting about this mountain, which sort of fills your imagination about how this could be some sort of palace for the gods or something. So we already reached the end of our trip. This is Wadahl, and over here is the airport where we will attempt to do our landing. But we might crash and die. It's considered a very difficult airport to land on, and in real life there has been accidents here. And since I am a terrible general aviation pilot, I might not make it. This is a small mountain town around this water called Gålavannet, and every year they have a festival here called the Per Gynt Festival. And I guess that's maybe why they have this airstrip, because thousands of people come here every year for this festival. And the reason why they have this festival, the background, everything about it, I can tell you maybe more about in the next video, because now we are going to attempt to do our landing. You can see how beautiful this is. Over here starts the most famous mountain ranges of Jotunheimen. They have very, very special significance, not only for Norway, but maybe for all of Scandinavia. A lot of the myths and legends in in Norse religion, Norse mythology, has to do with these mountains of Jotunheimen. And this is where you'll find some of the most beautiful mountains in Norway, and some of the most beautiful scenery, and the tallest mountain in Norway. And we will see all of that in the next video. So let's see if I can do this. Flaps up, gear down. I might stall this aircraft because I use a gamepad to fly. I don't have a joystick. I don't like flying with joysticks. Don't ask me why, but the problem with using a gamepad is that to throttle I need to use 2 buttons, and that works totally fine when you're flying jet aircraft, but when you're flying general aviation airplanes like this, it can be a little bit hard to finally adjust the throttle. So here we're coming up on this small grass strip. It's very short as well, so I might slide off the runway. And on the other side there are some power lines, so just to make things even worse. It's gonna be a little bit embarrassing if I crash in a video I intend to upload to YouTube, but I hope you can forgive my terrible flying. Maybe you can make your own video and do better. It's called Wadahl, this airport, but you need to download it. Oh, fuck. Oh, very hard. Damn it. and we're off the runway. So, can we come to a stop here? Well, we ruined the airplane, but we made it to the ground at least. So I think what we are going to do now is that we're going to park the airplane here, and then we're going to go into this house and drink some beer, and then we will try to fix the airplane tomorrow, and then we will continue on our trip into Jotunheimen and coming down on the western side of Norway. It's going to be a really interesting flight, I hope. So I hope this was enjoyable to maybe someone out there. If not, I did at least enjoy making it. And thank you for watching, and see you next time.